Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thanks so much for joining. I know it's the beginning of summer and it truly feels like summer out there. So I appreciate everyone taking the time out and we'll get started right on time. I know I've been getting a lot of emails and stuff just about people who have different things coming up, but they're still emailing their ideas and everything in. But it's summer, so it's a fun time, but also crazy schedule time. So I have like just a rough agenda up here, but I think as you guys could tell from our last discussion, I like things to be informal. I want it to be a discussion. I think that's where the best ideas come from. But overall, I just want to review a couple things, and I'm sorry, Tamara, I know you joined us in another group this week, so a little bit of my recap is going to be repetitive for you. There's a couple things, and I'll bring up a slideshow. Um, and I'll make, again, Tamara, I'm going to make the same joke as yesterday. What would a PowerPoint or what would a Zoom be without PowerPoint? So obviously, be respectful of everyone's opinions. Everyone's here for the right reasons. Obviously, this is a sensitive issue and people are really passionate about it because it's really important. So just be respectful of everyone and everyone's opinions. This is probably gonna be the most repetitive for you, Tamara, but I got a question every single group of like, what do we think the legislature is actually going to do? Are they interested in this? Are they looking at this? And there's some people who are really plugged in and they're paying attention to what the legislature is doing, but a lot of people are doing, their everyday lives and they're not paying attention to not a congressional hearing, but those are important too, but legislative hearing. So just want to do a quick update because last week there was a lot of education talk from the legislature. So there was the constitutional players convening on last Monday, and that was bringing together the governor's office, OPI, the Board of Public Education, and the legislative committees that handle education. So the Budget Interim Committee for Education and the Education Interim Committee. So it brought together a lot of the players in education to talk about education all day. A lot of the things that we talked about, they also talked about. Also, last week there was the interim committee hearings. So both those committees that participated in the constitutional players also held hearings where they talked about education. A lot of the things that we talked about, including teacher retention and teacher salary. And then there's ledge days as well. So besides the normal players who are always involved in education discussions, last week they brought in all the legislators for this kind of like mini breakout sessions and kind of just prep for next session. And two of the breakout sessions were about school funding. So it's something that not only the education committees are talking about, but the entire legislature is paying attention to. So I think that's really good news for everyone who cares about this issue, that it's something that everyone is talking about. Now we just have to figure out the path forward. So now I'm going to jump over quickly to our summary page for this group. And I kind of wanted to use this as the jumping off point for our discussion today, to kind of review what we talked about last time, what we want to talk about further, any thoughts that you guys had from our last discussion or things that you've come across since. There's also, before we can go over this a little bit and kind of, I'm just going to leave this up mostly in the background so we can use it as a reference point, but also in the group share drive. Sorry, I have a gazillion tabs up. So if you guys have a question about something, hopefully I have some numbers or a graph or something I can pull up. But so here's the group's resource link. So there's some things in here, including some things in here that I was hopeful that would answer some questions from last time. I know there was someone who had some questions about Indian Education for All. So I put a link in there that kind of has how the program works and how it's implemented by OPI, has some links to also how the Board of Education, Board of Public Education oversees that as well. I also put some information here about curriculum. I know there was a discussion about how curriculum is overseen in Montana. So there's some information on, information on Montana content standards, so as curriculum standards, but really, like as we talked about last time, it is local control. There's just kind of state like guidelines. But that goes into a lot of detail, and I don't want to belabor me talking about all this stuff. I want you guys to talk more but I just did want to say that I know there was questions about those things. There is reference material in here that goes into a lot of detail or a little detail, depending on how much you want to dig in. I know another thing that came up was after school programs and what after school programs there are in Montana. There was actually like OPI just announced a round of after school, can go to after school grants. I was just going to open that up. Actually, this is a slightly dated one. This is a list of schools that got that after school grant of 2001, but we just announced schools that got an after grants for this upcoming school years from ESSER funding. So it is a lot of the federal funding. So that is something we talked about last time too. How a lot of the after school programs don't really get as much state support. A lot of the support comes from federal grant programs. So that obviously stands true, but there were just a round of grants that went out across the state, and it was ESSER dollars. So those ESSER dollars are winding down now. They need to be all allocated by the end of this fiscal year on the federal calendar, not the state calendar. They have a different fiscal year, and then spent down over the next year. So I think that's a relative recap of some of the questions that were specific to this group, but happy to see if I can answer anything else. I'm going to stop talking because, again, I want to hear from you guys to see what thoughts you have and reflections you have on our discussion from last time, any new thoughts you may have, and then again, we can use this like kind of reference summary of our discussion as last time as a jumping off point, if you would like. So since Tamara, we've gotten to know each other and your camera's on, I'm going to kick it off to you first, and then please anyone jump in. It's a small group today, so I don't think we'll be talking over each other too much.
Yeah, no problem. It's interesting. I'm excited that legislators were meeting recently to talk about this and other issues, and it's reassuring to know that this whole budgeting issue is not only on their radar, but one of the things that they're actively engaging in conversations about, because I think it's a big issue for the state. So that's reassuring. And I think just to kind of reiterate a couple points like that we talked about before, like unfunded mandates and what can the state do to better support those things. If they want them happening, then some effort needs to be put in to financially help them to be happening. So that would be one of the key things that brought me to the table in terms of volunteering and being a part of this. So in my specific instance, it's lack of funding for gifted and talented, but I'm certainly aware that there are others in the same boat.
One of the things that I was thinking about what we can include in the white paper, and there's I think a number of tactics we can take, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the group yesterday of there's legislative requests, but then there's also requests that we can make of the legislative committee. They actually have to create legislation to establish the deennial school budget reform or study. So in that, they can actually direct specific things for them to look at. So other than like we can identify like, hey, the gifted and talented program is something that's required, but the funding's not there. I was also thinking it may be interesting for us to request that they specifically look into that. So they try to go back, and I know we can pick out, it's easy kind of to identify some of them, but I thought it might be nice to request that they look at across the board, try to identify all the areas where schools are required to do something and it costs money. Sometimes when things are originally passed, they don't even when they do cost studies and they don't think it's going to have a cost, sometimes later on you do see that it does incur costs. Even if it's small, it does add up. So I was thinking that something that we could include in the white paper was a request to do a more comprehensive look at all of the different unfunded mandates, or maybe underfunded mandates as well.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah. Um, in the specific example of the gifted and talented, it's underfunded. There technically is some funding, but it's my district gets anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 a year, so that's not exactly what is adequately needed to make everything happen. So, thank you.
And yeah, does the funding equate to the required mandate? So it's like, yes, you're mandated to do this, here's some money, but do those two things equal each other? Sorry, I'm also taking notes so I can do more summaries and build upon this as we start to kind of formulate the different ideas we have. And we did a good job of identifying some of the issues last week, but I don't want to pick on just Tamara. So there's 3 others that jumped on too. So I would love just kind of hear your guy of what you guys have been thinking about over the last couple weeks. If there's anything that's popped up in your mind of like, oh, this is something that I think is interesting and we should explore more, or the legislature should explore more. So I won't call on any of the 3 in particular, but would any of you guys like to throw some thoughts in here now too?
Hey everyone, this is Rachel with the Montana After School Alliance. And I mean, I think Catherine already sort of summarized it, and I sort of summarized it on my on the last call, but my job is to be here to be the voice of the programs that are really supporting our kids and our schools and our teachers when the school day ends, when the school year is out for the summer. And so, I mean, I think Catherine's right to point out that like the ESSER funding is going to some of the programs. I think that the 21st Century program is going to some of the programs, but that's actually, there isn't any dedicated state funding to these programs. And we need to figure out a way to get funding to these programs because they provide such an important, so many important services for our many communities across the state. And so, yeah, it's my job to continue to be here and to continue to make sure that that message is heard. Additionally, I think that there's some interesting national trends about like the Department of Education working better with the Department of Health and Human Services so that some of their requirements and some of their funding that goes to childcare providers looks like similar, or some of their program evaluation looks similar as the ones that are serving school age programs. That usually flows through education, whereas childcare usually flows through health. And so kind of bridging that a little bit better so that providers and programs aren't having to navigate both agencies and both sets of requirements, but can be a little bit more streamlined so that they can work together. There's lots of federal requirements on the funding that comes through about how that money is spent and if it can be combined or not combined, which is super complicated for programs. But if there's ever state funding or in the ways that the state can make it easier, that would allow more of our communities to have these kinds of programs. So I'm just going to say that on every meeting. I'm sorry to be the same broken record, but that's what I'm supposed to be here for.
Well, Rachel, I do have a request of you since you're here like kind of representing your organization. And I do like as I build the white paper, I will refer to some of the stats that we refer to here. I would love if you could provide like something for us to include in the white paper, like something like the top 4 bullet points of the how effective after school programs are. So I would really like it to be focused on something like numbers or statistic based. But if there's something like that you could provide me to include that you think is most influential to this discussion, that would be great.
Okay, yeah. Would you like that emailed to you later or?
Yeah, emailed, or you could also put it into the shared group folder, the Google Drive, but emailing to me is fine too, because I'll put it in there as well. So
okay, I will see what I can find. The data is not great because there's no funding to get that data, as is the case in many things.
I mean, or an example from a state too that, and I know, like you said, there's not that much data on it, but even if there's a program within a state that's been there for a couple years, they can use as an example. I'm just thinking legislators love like stats and they love examples. So just something along those lines to always beef up our ideas with, here's also some statistics to back what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah, I will try to, well, I will both send it and put it in a folder and get that to you in a week or so.
Oh yeah, no rush because we're like the white. I'll be working on the white paper throughout August, and so we have you have time.
Okay,
No
great.
rush. But I just was thinking that I like building that in, and since you're so tied in and with that organization, who instead of me looking for the stats, why not ask you, right?
Yeah, okay, that sounds good.
Awesome. Well, I know Mary just jumped on, so I know you kind of missed what we were talking about, but one of the things we were kind of reviewing just to bring you into where we are in the discussion is we just did a quick overview of kind of what we discussed last time and some questions that people had. And it just was like, here's reference points to answer those questions, go into more detail. And then what I have shared up on the screen is like a summary of the top line kind of points that I pulled out from our last meeting. So feel free to jump in at any point. It doesn't have to be in line to what we were just talking about.
This is Brittany. Oh,
Yep, so go ahead, Brittany.
nope. I was gonna say I missed last month, so I apologize. I have a lot of littles, and it was our last week of school, so I'm a little behind. I was just reading the summary, and I don't know if this is necessarily a program, but I know one thing we really struggle with being a small school is our number of special education students. What we get for special ed money doesn't even begin to cover the cost of our directors, let alone to hire paraprofessionals to work with those students. And it's getting to the point of like trying to not classify kids or get them on IEPs because we just don't have the funding for them. And then when you're writing into IEPs that this amount of time is required for services, but you can't financially provide those services, it's very challenging. So that is one obstacle I know we are really facing, is trying to meet the needs of our students in special education with our funding.
Special education is, I think, a huge topic. We have a whole group dedicated to that because so many people included special education as a topic for them. But everything intertwines. I've said that in every group. Like we can talk about anything because they all do intertwine. Oh, and then Mary, I just saw Mary's note. Hi, Mary. Sorry that you can't share. If you want to write stuff in the notes, though, I can read it out loud and we can discuss it. But special education is a huge issue, and talking about one of the things that they raised in the other groups was having multiple issues come along with that. So they've talked about not only just special ed kids, but also kids that have behavioral issues that maybe don't have the IEP, but also the teachers may need that extra help for some of the behavioral issues. But within special education too, the increase in special education students, but also the severity and the number of services needed has all increased. So one of the things some of the other groups, not just the special education group, talked about was increasing funding for special education students and making sure that the severity and the number of services needed are taken into account when the extra funding is provided by the state for their special education students. And then you've already seen this, Mary, but I'm going to show it because I think Brittany will probably find it interesting. Wait, that's not it. I have so many things up. Give me 1 second. I'm going to stop the share. But one of at the committee hearings last week, OPI provided some just documents that the committee requested. One of them was some interesting stats about teacher retention, which ties across all of the boards, including special education, and the reason why I wanted to share it, and I will bring it up again now that I found the document. And this is about teacher retention, and the turnover of teacher. And there was some really great, not great, but very interesting statistics about teacher retention. But something interesting is that the large turnover of special education teachers. So you have 12% turnover compared to 9% of general education. You also have 12% of science endorsement turnover. But then another interesting stat to look at and consider when we're discussing everything is the large turnover for young and entry-level teachers. So 30% turnover in the first year, 27% turnover in the 2 to 5 years, and then also in the 26 to 30 year demographic, 30% turnover. So it's just interesting to look at that, to think about the higher turnover, the stress that is on teachers, and how we integrate the younger teachers into the school and make them want to stay and make them want to become special education teachers or make them want to become gifted and talented specialists. So it's just something to consider while we continue our discussion.
And I think Mary hit the nail on the head. She just commented it takes forever to get to IEPs. And as someone that has a little with a very, very small SPED record, it is crazy monotonous, the amount of paperwork. And that's the only program I'm familiar with, I guess. And I know it's not on our sheet above. Like I'm sure after school programs have a lot of paperwork and gifted and talented have a lot of paperwork. It just seems like there's so much, or like the e-grants, I think I saw that on there. The grant process is difficult. There are so many steps and so much paperwork. Sometimes it's not even worth going through the process and going through each step to get to the end. And that might be part of that lack of, like Tamara was talking about, it's underfunded. You know, it takes so much time. It's such a process to get to the end results. There is some funding, but it doesn't get us the solution at the end that we're looking for. So.
And so I know it's a little, you guys have the experience from the ground level and where none of us are like the intricate budget experts, but where do you find like the most, I guess, like acute problems, as far as like, where's the lack of funding for, since we're on special education, for special education? I know within that special education group, one thing they raised was, the lack of funding specifically and the increase in needs and services for younger kids. So preschool in particular, they're feeling an acute pinch. And Mary, to build upon yours too, one of the things we were talking about was some of the provider shortages for like OT and PT as well.
And I don't know what everyone else's titles are on here. I am a brand new clerk, so I'm in my first year. And I guess I don't know the entire special ed funding formula. But I would say all the services that you're required to provide are a big part of it, and they're all taken into consideration. You know, the only leeway we really have is with tuition. You know, this sounds horrible, as I almost pray for one-on-one kids because I can use that formula in their spreadsheets and get a good majority of their para and their funding to have that kid. But it's to me, it's your 1 or 2 hour kids that require a lot of work. But when you put them into that spreadsheet, you get $0 for them. And so that's a brand new clerk perspective. I've not been in it long enough, so I feel like to make a really good, educated, knowledge-based finding on it. But that is the one thing I see. We don't have the training. You know, we're trying to hire paraprofessionals to work with, like you said, behavior. Behavior is a big one for us. So they have no specific training. They're coming with maybe even just a high school diploma or an associate's degree, trying to find the training, trying to get them to train, trying to pay for training, trying to keep them. You know, we've had a huge turnover of paras just as much as we have special ed teachers. And so I think there's a lot that goes into it, and no different than the shortage of OTs and PTs, even in our co-ops. And that's, even the co-ops are a lot of money. But services you're required to have, so you pay the money because you're required to have them. And so I feel like there's the whole funding formula needs to be looked at as far as what's being required of us as a district, what are we required to provide, what's getting paid for those positions. You know, those co-ops are having to recruit at a higher rate to get those people here. And is it still being funded at the same amount it was when the funding formula was made?
Well, and there are tiers, I guess, for the severity of special needs and the services they required. And most states do, or there's some states that also take a slightly different approach where they kind of average what is the likely rate of special needs within that school. That school gets that money for what is likely the population of special needs. And then there's like a supplemental for unexpected or overly expected expenses for certain special needs. But here in Montana, we do have a tiered system. But looking at that, you can always build into more things. And that was something also raised, what you mentioned, to having like, there's sometimes what is overlooked is, yes, there's a kid that has a severity of needs. There's a lot of different services. There is kind of a backstop at some point for extra money for that. But sometimes what we forget about is how much services and how much time and resources go into the kids that don't have the severe needs, but do need some extra time. So that was something that was also raised in the other group that focuses on that. So we know there's like a broad range of challenges, but some of the things that I started to want to try to turn and focus on, yeah, and Mary just, I think I just echoed what Mary said in there. Just, it doesn't cover necessarily the complexity. And we've just seen really large increases in the number of students that are special needs, need special services. And we've also seen an increase in the gifted and talented, but not that same increase. So finding ways that we could have that personalized education, make sure that those needs are addressed for those students is obviously really important. But I want to start turning to, we have like there's obviously a number of issues and we can keep pointing to issues, but I start to want to turn towards more identifying specific things that we can recommend or specific ways forward. So it can be like the big picture when we're looking at reconfiguring the whole budget formula, the additional formula it's used to supplement for special education students. We can look smaller picture as in grant programs, which is often how after school programs are funded. And even community efforts or requests. So we can one of the things that another group was talking about was, and why I brought it up before, was requesting that the committee direct the study in certain ways to look at specific things to make sure they're at least having a focus on an area that we think is underfunded or an area that's under spotlighted too. So when we're thinking about solutions and path forward, any of the issues we talked about or any of the issues on here we can identify and pick. But does anyone want to pick one issue that we could talk about and start identifying where we would like that to improve and then how we can get that improved? Well, pick one. Again, obviously we talked about special education and increasing funding to that. That's kind of a straightforward request, just making sure they take in the severity of needs and they're actually funding the needed services. So the PT and OT, which those increases have gone up just like everything else with inflation. But then you talked about the lack of paraprofessionals and teachers. And since teacher retention and teacher salary was a hot topic at the legislature, let's talk about that a little bit and where you guys see you would like that to go and what solutions you think would be the best to helping us recruit teachers and helping us retain teachers. Obviously, salary increases being part of that.
That was the one from the list that I was going to recommend because it kind of seems to cut across a lot of the common issues, and it seems to be it seems to be a challenge for pretty much all Montana schools, especially the more rural they are. So, I don't know that I necessarily have any ideas or solutions. I know one thing that we did in our district was we raised that base pay for entering teachers much higher than what the state average was in an effort to try and make ourselves more attractive for teachers entering the profession. So, but being able to do that costs more money. So,
Well, we'll go step by step. Um, and yes, Mary says we have a funding formula that's overly complicated. And that is, it's, you know what, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So sometimes when we go try to solve a problem, sometimes it can make the budget more complicated, but also it can also sometimes make more things more equitable too. So there's always ways that we could try to, like, it's a needle you have to thread. And I do say this because I'm paying attention to what other states are doing. A lot of the conversations that we're having are conversations that are happening in every state. I have family in New Jersey, and they're talking about the inflation pressures, and the reduction in state aid to some of the schools, and what backstops are they going to pass. In Massachusetts, I'm naming schools or naming states I've tied to. I went to school in Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, they're also talking about inflationary pressures. So there's a lot of things that we could look at of like what other states are doing. But going back to the teacher pay, one of the things I wanted to just hear your guys' opinion on, because it's something that the legislature is discussing. So right now there is a quality teacher incentive, quality educator payment that goes to schools. It's for teachers in their first couple years, and it's to encourage higher salaries. And I'm summarizing this, but it's to encourage higher salaries, and then the schools get an extra, right now, $3,000 to help fund the salaries of those educators. So one of the things that's been discussed is expanding that program. Another proposal that was put out there by one of the education groups is having more weight on something like that, the quality educator payments, or more weight on the money that's tied to the teachers at the school, and less focus on A and B. And that is a very, very, very simplified version of that proposal. But those are the types of things that the legislature is looking at right now. Does that make sense to you guys and we'll get to the next step of where to find the money. But is that the type of things that you guys think the legislature should be looking at? Or what else should they be looking at in that picture?
I think that tying the money a little more to the teachers rather than just A and B makes sense. When you think about it from the point of view of like a really small school that might only have, say, 25 kids, that's not a whole lot of A and B, and yet they're going to need 3, 4 teachers. There needs to be someone functioning as an administrator part of the time. They need to be joining co-ops, and so the A and B doesn't reflect the number of adults needed to still make that work for them. So I think it's a reasonable idea. I don't know how receptive it would be, because I can see where it could be said like, oh, this is just looking out for the teachers, not the students. I think that how it's explained and referenced would be important, rather than it being that this is about supporting the teachers, because I don't think that's the intent of this, but I think it would be perceived as that. That it's showing that its funding of education is more about making sure that the resources are there for the students. And the reality of education is it's a very human endeavor. And as as the humans involved are the adults and the kids.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like a quality versus or like a proficiency, something that's based on, required to meet all these standards and required to do these things. And we are one of the small schools. The first thing I asked some of our clerks, as I said, here's our budget. What do you do? How do you start cutting this? First thing they told me was combine classes, which is always easier said than done. Is it your kid you want in the combined class versus that individual education? So one thing we're trying this year is, and I don't really know what to call it. It's not combined. We're doing more of like a pod model. I know a lot of the large schools do this, and this is how they get their young teachers in and comfortable is we're doing a 4, 5, 6, and we have one teacher doing all math and science, one teacher doing all English and reading, and then a paraprofessional doing the extras. And the big schools, I listened to a SAM webinar. They talked about him doing this with, entire 5th or 6th grades in big schools, but they had like 2 lead teachers, 2 main teachers, 2 senior in high school or 2 senior in college going to graduate in there, and then maybe a para. But those graduates were working under somebody. So there was that comfortable level, that initiative or initiation. They weren't in charge of it by themselves. Your head teacher was doing the majority of the curriculum planning and the scoping and that kind of stuff. And so it was really interesting to think about. That's how they were getting their young teachers, 1 in the door and 2 to stay. And then their higher teachers, your master teachers over those pods were getting paid more. And so it was kind of an interesting web of how they did it. Obviously it doesn't work where I am, but we're trying something similar so that we still have our kids are getting a base education with a teacher, and not just combining per se and creating more work. And so this will be our first year in it come this fall, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I think it'll go well. Everyone's really excited about it, but it's just something that we had to do because we couldn't afford to not do something like that. And number 2, we couldn't find a teacher for that other class. And so, but I do think it'd be interesting to see what they could do. I don't have a great, example for the funding solution, but the quality or proficiency. And I'm maybe stepping ahead, Katie, so you can tell me if I need to stop, but someone's gonna probably shoot me for saying this, but consolidation. I know when I talked to South Dakota, we were talking about recruiting a superintendent out of there, and we just got visiting about different funding formulas, and they consolidated a couple years ago. A lot of their small schools that are close enough to where you can still bus kids in a relatively appropriate time frame. But they consolidated and gave different funding structures to like your really rural schools, or it was all on percentages, and I don't quite understand it, but that was one thing they did, and one thing that's made me curious how it would affect our budgets. I know that there's schools 10 miles from other towns that are still open and still getting, if it's a high school, that's a pretty good chunk of money that if it got distributed out would be extremely helpful. So I don't know if that's the answer. I just thought it was interesting talking to them, that happened a couple years ago. And then our new superintendent is coming from Wyoming, and I thought this was interesting. They have, the state does all of their building. So like, we raise all of our own levies for our building reserves or a lot of our projects, and their state is who funds that. And it's kind of an application process, but once you're approved, you just kind of sit in a waiting line until your money is there for your project. I thought that was interesting because a lot of small schools, and I'm really lucky, we do pass a lot of our levies, but I know some don't. How do you ever fix a boiler or build a new school or fix your cafeteria? I mean, I do feel bad for those schools because there's your lack of teacher pay right there. It's getting held for a big blow up with your school, and having no building reserve is challenging for those schools that can't pass those levies and support it, and directly affects the teacher pay.
You hit on a lot of good topics, actually. And Mary, I see your comment too. So let's go back to Mary's after we hit on, maybe expand upon some of Brittany's. So consolidation was actually something brought up in one of the groups yesterday, and it was it was a rural group, and it was someone in a rural community who would probably be most affected by any type of consolidation. And I try to be an impartial arbiter. I hear ideas, I bring them to you guys, want to see how you feel about them, but I'm just here basically to take notes. There was a study like years ago about consolidation in Montana. Montana does have like more school districts than any other state, especially compared to the population. So we have over 800 schools and we have 400 school districts. So when you're looking at specific at the school districts, you're right. There's maybe a possibility like for sharing at least the resources of a superintendent that maybe you don't have one superintendent for a school district with one small school. Maybe superintendents or like some of the administration can be shared between school districts. That was something that was brought up in the legislature. And another thing, which is kind of like, I would say a bridge between like full on consolidation, which you're right, it is a very touchy subject. And I understand why schools, are the center of the community. So I totally get why it is. Doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. But a bridge between those two ideas was enabling schools to share teachers. So a teacher can spend, especially I think this works really well because I grew up in a school like this. We shared our music teacher. So our music teacher spent 3 days with our school and then went 2 days to another school district. So I do think that works well for more specialist fields if you want to be able to bring someone, a science teacher, same type of thing. That was something they talked about, is facilitating that between, like you said, schools that are within, a reasonable distance of each other, being able to share some of those teachers or specialized services. And I think I mentioned, or I think we talked about this in the group, Tamara. I think something like that could really work well for, the talented students. So I think things like that, especially in the more rural communities, could be good. Else I'm trying to remember because Brittany hit a bunch of things. Oh, for the building maintenance fund, I do know that in Wyoming, and I don't have like all the stats off the top of my head, but they do use a lot of their resource money. So from oil and gas and all that stuff to fund their building fund. We do have some of that in Montana. Wyoming has more. And we do have public lands. And we do have public lands that the land board oversees, that money from leasing of those lands does go to fund public schools. And it's about, I think in fiscal year 2023, it was about $323 per student came from money from the public lands that are for funding education. Yeah, Wyoming has done a lot of funding through a lot of their resource development. So those are things we could look at of where our funding goes in Montana. Do we want to realign funding? In other groups we talked about, where I feel like I'm being drummed, but where these different pots of money go. So where does the marijuana tax money go? Where does the lottery tax money go? So all these different pots of monies and different streams of money come in, and one of them is not going to be, the silver bullet for funding education. But I do think it's important for the legislature and for all you guys to look at where the funding streams come in for our state, and what do we want to prioritize in our state, and where that funding goes and how we divvy that up. And then Mary, I just wanted to give you a shout out for what you said. So Mary said, and everyone can see the chat, but I'm still going to read it out loud. But they also need to accept the fact that you can't assign a per student cost to many parts of the budget, like teacher pay. You need the same number of teachers for 15 kids as you do for 20. And that was a discussion in another one of the groups, was that possibly using a combination of money tied to the teacher and money tied to A and B. So you kind of say like you said, for whether you have 20 fifth graders or 15 fifth graders, you still need a fifth grade. So you're still taking into account the A and B, but you're also taking into account that you need that teacher either way. So I think that is some of the reasoning behind making a payment for the teacher, a bigger payment, and a payment that is more eligible, or more people are eligible for that payment, because right now it's just beginning year teachers and I know some people have proposed every teacher gets an extra payment, or every district gets an extra payment from the state for that teacher.
We had that conversation with our old superintendent before he left. One thing he mentioned, and I don't know if this is worth noting, Katie, and those other ones, is you're probably going to have to create a minimum for that, only for the fact that, because we have some really tiny elementary schools in our county. So I have one of the elementary schools, I have the big elementary school, and then the high school. But I could see where rural schools would take advantage of that to say, well, I have 2 second graders, 2 third graders, and a 4th grader. I have 5 kids in my entire building, but I need 3 teachers. And so, and he made a very valid point, like, you know, do you have to have a minimum of, I don't know what it is, 6 kids, 8 kids, whatever, you know, up to your maximum class size that MCA says you can have. But I can see where if they do something per class, which I 100% agree with, because the curriculum per kid isn't $8,000, you know, whatever you get for your A and B, 7 something. But I could see, like I said, where people would take advantage of it, and then that's money out of the budget. How does that affect us long term if we're funding all of those? You know, all these small schools that weren't getting as much are getting triple, and where is that coming from and affecting us long term?
Well, I think that's a great point. It's something that people brought up yesterday too, was kind of like the opposite of, are you just shifting the dollars? So schools end up getting the same dollars, but we're saying it's tied to the teacher versus tied to the student, and it still doesn't address the disparities. So you're right, it is, and I'll say it again, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So anytime you create a program, there's always opportunities for fraud. And that comes down to the nitty gritty of, and hopefully, in a previous life, I used to write legislation, but that's why you work with the legislators. So thinks about the pros and cons. Like, these are the downsides, these are the negatives. What can we build into this bill to stop from encouraging negative behaviors and encourage positive behaviors? And a lot of times you have to revisit stuff too. So you pass a bill and then you're like, oh, these are the unintended consequences. We have to go back and fix it. But those are very important to think of those cons ahead of time, and how do you adjust for that within legislation to create those guardrails so there is not abuse and you're not exploding the budget, and you're making sure the resources are directed to where it's most needed. Okay, well, we talked about teacher salaries a bit. For recruitment for teachers. We started to get into a little bit of just support, and we talked about the grant funding, which I think ties into that too, of the administrative burden, the support teachers need just out, not just like within the classroom in the traditional sense, but also with the behavioral issues. The COVID learning loss is still affecting children. So different ways we can help improve the working environment. Here, I'll switch back to this real quick. This is interesting too. When teachers left, they asked them what is the #1 reason, and obviously salary is a big reason, but these were huge reasons. #1 was poor working conditions, lack of preparation, stress, high workloads, lack of mentorship and support. So those are all things that we can think about too, of how we can try to address those in a legislative manner or within a community manner too. There is a mentorship program in Montana. It is small, they're growing, and I think there's ways we can expand it, not just for the new teachers, but also expand mentorship for teachers who have been in the field even for years. Having that support, I think, is obviously very important.
I didn't want to stop you, but I just put this in the chat. This was also something that was brought up to us by one of our new teachers, is ease of certifications and being able to have multiples. We're really, really close to South Dakota, and for them, everything over there, once you have a degree, is pretty much a praxis. And so they're certified across a lot of different curriculums. And it was really interesting to me that it's quite inexpensive to take a praxis in multiple fields, and then they're able to teach those, and then they get those quality educators. I do feel like that's something that we could do better, and I think OPI is trying to, realign some of their licensure.
Yeah.
But that is one thing I know, especially like for us small schools, we have teachers that could teach 4 periods of something and 3 periods of something, but they're not going to go back to school for 2 or 3 years and pay that because it's never going to be worth the money. And so I do think that is something overall. I mean, I know the double A's and A's probably aren't that way, but I think a lot of B's and C's could use people. I would personally rather pay more as a clerk for somebody with multiple endorsements than somebody with a master's degree, because they are way more valuable to us than the masters.
No, I think that makes sense. And also something that was brought up, because there's some people in other groups that either have lived in other states years ago or actually recent people here, and they've taught in other states too. So having one of the things they brought up was easier reciprocity. And I know especially if you're on a border, like you may be able to, it's very easy to hire someone from South Dakota. So that was something that they brought up, that reciprocity was difficult for them moving here. So I know we talked a lot about teacher retention, and there's some other things that I could pull from our summary to talk about. But I know there's different people on here, and I know some of these topics that I could pull out are from people that are not on the call today. So instead of me pulling out things that maybe aren't a top priority for you guys, what are other top priorities or issues that you're seeing, and how would you like to see that fixed? We can also start to move into where we would like to see revenue come from, or how can we recalibrate that? Well, I know one of the ideas, and I was watching one of the revenue committee hearings and they started talking about it. I need to dig in more of what exactly was said. But one of the really popular ideas across all the groups is how can we capture money from the out-of-staters who come and have their second homes here, or all the tourists that come here. And because obviously everyone's feeling the stress from their property taxes, and everyone's property values have gone up, and that's why the property taxes have gone up, along with other things. I know I'm simplifying it. So we don't want to put that crush on Montanans anymore. So one of the ideas was, how can we try to capture that revenue more? And some people had some ideas, but I don't want to spoil it if anyone here has an idea. So when looking at how to capture some of that revenue, what do you guys think?
They give ideas beyond ways that we already do that, like the hotel tax, for example.
So yeah, there's obviously tourist taxes. You could look at increasing tourist taxes. One thing that's done in some cities, it's done in some places in Canada too, and it's something that was brought up in other groups, was taxing second homes for non-residents or vacant homes. So if a home is vacant for a certain percentage of the year and that you're not utilizing it or renting it out, or taxing rental properties, verbos, short-term rental, not, the normal rentals, but the short-term rental properties at different rates. Some of these things have been done in cities, and there are repercussions to doing these things, but it is something that we could look at.
Anybody
Trying
say
to,
sales tax?
oh, sorry, what'd you say?
Did anybody bring up sales tax?
Yeah.
Not
So,
not that I personally want to pay more taxes, but
well,
I know that's been brought up around here is sales tax, and I don't know how to say this, but I mean I know the property owners pay taxes, but there's a lot of people we notice that aren't buying property to not pay taxes, and so instead they're renting. And so we have a lot of residents not paying taxes on anything.
Did anyone mention kind of the change that was made in a recent legislative session that doesn't really allow cities to do resort taxes any longer? Because a lot of like certain ones that had already had it in, like Whitefish, they can use it for their schools. And then other towns who kind of like were interested in it, the legislature kind of made that requirement go away. And so then we have a pretty big disparity between the ones that have already been able to do that and can improve their schools using those types of things, and smaller towns that are really affected by tourists but don't get to use that any longer as an option.
And well, that's why we're talking, right? So you can request that the legislature remove those caps. It's not exactly the same, but states have caps. I've seen it in other states. States will have caps on what the communities are allowed to increase. In other states, and we have that here in other areas too. We have the max budget too, right? So lifting caps on things is something that can be recommended. So lifting a cap on the ability for a community to raise taxes on something, lifting, the inflation cap is like technically kind of it's a cap, but the legislature can remove that cap. But that's the point. Caps can be moved, and that can be recommended to the legislature that caps or restrictions be removed.
Well, I mean, we're such a community specific, like community control state, and yet we take away the ability of our communities to prioritize what they want to prioritize in their communities. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's an important recommendation to give to them.
And I think that's exactly what I said. That's an important point to make of how you make those points. And then I've also seen in other states too, where maybe there's a compromise. And again, not advocating for any of these things, but I've also seen in other states where the state may have a cap on a community from them for whatever to raise property taxes. But if the community is allowed to actually take a vote and overturn that temporarily to then raise whatever the property taxes for whatever reason. So there's ways you can thread that needle too. If the state doesn't want to concede all the way, but find that middle ground where if communities in certain circumstances want to go against that, they can take actions too. So there's different solutions to those things as well.
Could we include in that, I never thought about before, but increasing what we're allowed to adopt for our max budgets?
Yeah, and that's exactly my point. Again, not advocating or not advocating for or against, but that's something you can ask the legislature, say, if the community wants to, let the community go over their max budget, remove that restriction. Like I said, there's states who have done that. States have looked at doing that, especially just in the last couple of years because of inflation. So some states that also have caps on their communities and districts from raising it over a certain percentage have lifted or waived those caps temporarily due to the high increase in inflation. So there is precedent for that in other states. So we're running into our hour time frame. I was about to bring up another thing, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time and know that just because we got together for this hour, like I said, there's other people who haven't been able to join on because I know I picked times, these are the days, and a lot of people have coaching, soccer practice or whatever, but still want to participate. So those people email me things or check in, they watch videos, I get feedback from our videos. So don't hesitate to reach out in between these things, reach out to each other. Feel free to send me anything that you think of. Like I said, I love stats and examples of ideas. Like, I think this is a good idea. Another state has done this, or I think this is a good idea. Studies have shown that this helps kids. Legislators love that. So when you're trying to sell your idea to them, backing it up with those things, they eat it up. So those are always things to keep in mind. I'm going to prepare another document and have some more stuff going out to you guys. In the meantime, just let me know if there's anything you need from me, if you want some more information on anything. Mary, I saw a lot of your notes over here. Thank you for participating. Sorry that you couldn't talk. And I apologize for having you guys all listen to me talk this much right now. So thanks again for your time, and any parting comments before you guys go enjoy the rest of your night. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy your night. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
Enjoy
Take
your
care.
lunch.